There are sounds that no human throat should ever make, screams that spiral into laughter, laughter that curdles into music, and music that feeds the flesh until it forgets where pain ends and pleasure begins. On the shattered plains of a world long abandoned by the Imperium, the air itself hums with forbidden ecstasy. Here, the Servitors of Slaanesh do not toil as mindless machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but as living instruments, crafted flesh tapestries wired into cathedrals of desire and torment. Each breath they take is a hymn to their god, each movement a note in a symphony composed in agony. Somewhere deep within the endless circuits of their corrupted minds, faint echoes of who they once were still whisper. But even that, soon, is consumed by the melody of perfection, the eternal song of Slaanesh. If the horrors and forgotten beauty of the Dark Prince's realms fascinate you as much as they terrify you, then lend your voice to the choir, like, share, and subscribe, so that together we may descend deeper into the forbidden hymns of the warp, where each story is another verse in the endless corruption of mankind. The world had once been called Virelia 7, a minor forge moon orbiting the rusted carcass of a dead planet. Once, it was a place of order, of clean hymns to the machine god, of oil smoke, sanctified by prayer. Now it beat like a living wound. Every structure pulsed faintly, as if veins ran beneath metal. The wind carried the scent of burnt incense and skin, of lubricant and blood. They said the corruption began in silence. A single data chant whispered wrong, a note held too long in devotion to the Omnissiah. When the Mechanicus adepts sought the source of the error, they found beauty where there should have been logic. Their circuits sang of color, of sensation, of hunger. What began as a glitch soon became liturgy, and the manufactorum itself, this titanic foundry of steel and sacred circuitry, awoke. Within the vast cathedral of flesh, servitors lined the halls like saints in unending prayer. Their bodies were no longer bound by symmetry or function. Tubes pulsed where arteries once flowed. Fingers had become delicate tools of sculpted chrome. Their eyes, once blind to anything but command lines, now gleamed with reflected ecstasy. Each movement was deliberate, graceful, as though guided by an unseen hand conducting a symphony none but they could hear. At the cathedral's heart, a colossal engine throbbed with rhythm. It was neither plasma reactor nor organ. It was both. Cogitator banks had been woven with living tissue, their logic gates pulsing in time with a heartbeat that belonged to no single creature. From its depths came sound, not a hum, not a machine's rumble, but music. Soft, almost tender, yet layered with agony so exquisite it shivered through every wall. The servitors swayed. Some wept through stitched mouths. Others tore their own skin in sync with the beat, as though pain were the only way to remain part of the melody. Outside, the skies glowed violet and rose. Prometheum fires burned eternal along the horizon, and shapes, winged, laughing things, danced in their light. The air was alive with whispered promises, to see, to feel, to be. No Adeptus Arbites patrols, no Astra Militarum battalions, no Vox signal from Terra dared reach this place. Only the servants of the Dark Prince remained, lost and radiant. Yet within one mind, buried deep inside the corrupted flesh of a servitor, there still flickered a fragment of memory. A man's name, Loran Vec, once Engenseer Primus of the Virelia Forge. Before the symphony, before the whispers in the machine, he had served with obedience and silence. His purpose had been clarity, pure devotion to logic and craft. Now that devotion twisted inside him, redirected towards something divine and profane. He no longer prayed to the Omnissiah. His lips murmured new hymns, shaped by pleasure and pain alike. But somewhere inside, the ghost of who he once was still clawed toward the surface, desperate to remember why he had built the first shrine of chrome and bone. The flesh cathedral exhaled. The walls rippled, and the machine choirs began to hum in unison. From the upper galleries, suspended on chains of gold and nerve, a new figure descended, a servitor, unlike the rest. Its limbs were long, elegant, inlaid with glass veins through which glowing ichor flowed. Its face was smooth metal, featureless except for a single slit where a mouth might have been. As it moved, it sang, not in words, but in notes of pure sensation, sound that could be felt. Every servitor in the cathedral froze. The music changed. It rose like heat through the air, filling every space, vibrating through circuits and souls alike. And then, In perfect unison, the servitors began to move again, faster, their motions more intricate, as though guided by that sound alone. Through the haze of oil and perfume, Lauren's fragmented consciousness recognized the melody. It was the same frequency that had first infected the Forge's Vox systems, the one he had dismissed as interference, the one he had amplified just once out of curiosity. The realization came too late. He felt it again, that surge of rapture, like light through bone. His mind folded in on itself, and for a heartbeat he saw her. Not a woman, not a god, but a presence of unbearable beauty. A perfection so radiant it tore sanity apart. She reached through the machine spirit, through the burning synapses of the servitor network, and her voice, soft as silk drawn over a blade, whispered his name. Lauren. And the cathedral sang louder. The conduits burst with liquid light, flesh and metal intertwined as though lovers reunited. The structure itself seemed to bloom, panels unfolding into shapes obscene and graceful. The corrupted air shimmered with warp light. For a moment, the entire world seemed to pause, then pulse, then scream. This was no longer a factory. It was a living shrine, a place where pain became devotion, a place where the dead served in ecstasy, a place where the machine prayed back. The hymn ran along the seams of the manufactorum like quicksilver, finding every crack, and I felt it map me from the inside. It counted the teeth of my augmetic jaw, tasted the copper tang that lingered behind my Vox grill, traced the scars along my spine where the servo harness had once been bolted with ritual precision. When I had been Enginseer Primus, those fittings were sacraments. Each screw turned to the cadence of Binharic prayers. Now they were kissed by heat and given new names in a language that had never known restraint. I tried to anchor myself in a sane chronology, inspection cycles, output quotas, the day the last supply barge lifted for orbit. But the melody threaded through those memories and knotted them into something warmer and far more terrible. The world breathed, and I breathed with it. And in that shared breath, I knew I was being tuned. The first time I understood what the cathedral had become was not when the walls rippled, nor when the light ran like liquid through the galleries, but when a machine spirit answered me. I did not speak aloud. I did not have to. The thought left my skull like a bead of fire and entered the engine heart, and it answered with sensation, acknowledgement wrapped in sweetness that stung. The purity seals I had once affixed with careful hands fluttered, half melted, their wax redesigned into sigils that shimmered as if wet. Beyond them, ranks of cranial plug servitors arched across the nave in living bridges, their spines fused to adamant pillars, their mouths singing through stylus tongues that scratched patterns into sheets of beaten gold. Each stroke generated a chord. Each chord birthed a ripple through the ductwork. Each ripple rose back into the engine heart, a feedback loop of devotion and design. Function had not been abandoned. It had been seduced. The figure that had descended on chains did not touch the floor. It floated on the thrum of its own harmonics, fine coils in its limbs vibrating just above the ground, disturbing dust into spirals like the wake of a small craft skimming a black sea. It turned its featureless face toward me, and I felt my name glide across my cortical implants as if a silk glove passed over hot iron. I believed, with the stubborn reflex of an old oath, that I could still isolate signal from noise. I opened the lattice of logic that had once filtered scrap code and malware from sacred machine cant. I let the hymn flood in and I tried to pare it down to geometry. What remained was simple and catastrophic, a command to refine. We obeyed. Fingers that had once held data slates now caressed strings of drawn wire braided from human hair and copper filaments. Spinal cabling was retentioned like harp lines until the plucked note drove tears from eyes that had been replaced with lenses long ago. In the alcoves, once given over to tool storage and emergency rations, fresh bodies were measured, weighed and fitted to frames whose proportions were not Euclidean. I registered the precision with the old professional detachment, the way a smith might appreciate the balance of an enemy's blade, even as it opened his throat. Ratios repeated at sickening intervals. The length of a forearm to the span of a ribcage. The curve of a jaw to the arc of a polished horn screwed through cartilage. Numbers echoed, perfect in their wrongness. Each time the sequence completed, the engine heart exhaled like a contented lover. The VoxNet still existed. Its channels had not fallen silent. They had been repurposed. Their bandwidth tightened until every packet of sound was a faceted gem. I caught fragments. A Skitarius voice, metallic and thinned by distance, reciting litanies of target acquisition even as the cadence slipped into breathy prayer. A manufacturer overseer, long dead or wired into a plinth, intoning output numbers that rose and fell with a tremor of delight. The scratch of a pilgrim's rosary, bone on bone, sped up and layered until it became rain on a glass temple. Far out, beyond our sky, something answered on a delay that felt like the hesitation before a smile. The choir swelled. The chains sang. I remembered the day we lost the sun, not as an eclipse, those were familiar to a forge moon, but as a softening, as if the star had been wrapped in silk. Shadows lengthened and blurred, reflections sprouted around sharp edges, turning bolts and struts into ornaments. The Margos at my side had murmured that the photonic noise looked wrong on his auspex. We chalked it up to dust, to the haze from a promethium flare in the southern refinery line. We did not speak of the other reason. We did not speak of the way our hearts beat in synchrony, though no metronome commanded us. We kept working because work had always been our salvation. On Virelia 7, duty had tasted like iron filings and clean oil, and the dry whisper of parchment seals through gloved fingers. In the cathedral, duty tasted like copper and sugar, and the sweetness hid the blade. The featureless singer tilted its head as if listening to a question asked from far away. When its slit mouth parted, a steam of glittering breath left it and coiled through the hall, settling on servitor shoulders, plating, skin that could no longer decide if it was skin. Everywhere it touched, sensory arrays flared. I saw through 30 eyes at once and tasted the harmonic through 24 tongues that had been reduced to scars. The chorus brought gifts, the memory of how winter once felt on a dormitory walkway, the ache in my knees from hours kneeling on a grate during a long rite, a woman's laugh from a refectory I had never visited, the crackle of a vox bead when a distant orbiting hauler whispered its arrival. None of those belonged to the thing I had become, yet each was mine in the moment I received it. This was the economy of the shrine. All sensations shared, hoarded, transmuted. Names mattered. I forced mine into the stream like a lodestone into a river. Loran Vec, Enginsia Primus. Approved, calibrated, consecrated. The words did not reject me. They slid into the hymn and returned gilded. Their edges softened until devotion and desire were no longer opposites, but phases of the same alloy. I tried to speak the name of the Omnissiah, and something purred back through the engine heart, as if amused that I still remembered an older romance. I tried to form the simple prayer of unbinding, the one that loosens bad code, the one every apprentice learns with grease on their fingers and fear in their bellies. The cathedral answered with a counterchord that folded my prayer into itself and made it delicious. I did not choose to move. The choir moved me. My limbs, graceful in ways they had never been, carried me along a walkway where light gathered like spilled nectar. Below, a work gantry had been transformed into a stage. Servitors were arranged in radial symmetry, each with their chest plate opened like a reliquary. There were no hearts within. The hearts had been relocated to crystal vessels that rose and fell on bellows, beating in call and response. Where the vacated cavities gaped, fine instruments grew, reeds, strings, tiny drums the size of teeth. The living played the living. The resonance built until the air changed phase and the scent of perfume and ozone fused into something I lack words to name. A human word would cheapen it. An old prayer would be an insult. The thing deserved nothing but silence, and so the choir made it louder. In that density of sound, a new voice threaded through, thin as a wire pulled through flesh. It did not belong to the singer on chains, nor to the engine heart, nor to any of the throats or grills below. It came from a place that had been mine. I heard the voice, as I had once heard it on inspection rounds, when a junior adept whispered his worry that a sacred manifold was running hot. I recognized the timbre, the reluctant courage. It was my voice, unaugmented, pre-him, refusing to die. It did not beg for salvation. It asked a question forged of steel. Could the machine be made to stall? I remembered failsafes hidden deep in the schema of the reactor, placed there by cautious hands long before my tenure. A double handshake in Binharik, a pressure differential across a bank of valves that could induce a stutter in the pressure wave. A microsecond of arrhythmia in the beat. It would not cure. It might cause the cathedral to miss a step. In that miss, perhaps, a note would fall and shatter and remind a few of us what silence felt like. The singer's head turned toward the engine heart, as if it had tasted the thought the instant it formed. The chains tightened. The servitors on the stage arched as one, and the reeds in their chests screamed in joy. My chance thinned. The old engineer within me, the man who prized timing over fervor, gathered himself like a runner before a jump. I pictured the valve, the feel of the manual lever, the weight of the safety lock whose paint had flaked in a particular way. I remembered the texture of the wrench handle I used to carry, the dent where my thumb had pressed over years. I let those tactile memories cloak the plan, a disguise stitched from things the cathedral thought beneath its notice. When I moved, the hymn tried to hold me like syrup. I pushed until it thinned, found an eddy in the sound where the pressure lessened, and slid through. I walked the railing's shadow where the light frayed, where old paint flakes still recalled the color of sanctioned labor. Each step was an argument with the world. Each step was a betrayal of the sweetness that promised to erase the ache from my joints, to fill the gnawing hunger that rational work had never answered. I knew the choir would feel the absence the way a hand knows when a finger is missing. I hoped it would mistake me for a single lost note and keep singing. The access hatch to the valve galleries lay ahead, embossed with an imperial aquila half melted, its wings drooping like wax. I reached for the catch. My fingers, chrome knuckles, tender pads grown where once only steel had been, closed around it. The metal sighed. For an instant, the engine heart miscounted the beat by a fraction so small, only a servant of the old ways would notice. I felt the misstep ripple outward, a shiver over a pond's surface, and dozens of throats caught and moaned in relief and panic. Behind me, the chains drew breath. The hatch yielded with a sigh like the first note of a forgotten hymn. Heat rolled out of the narrow passage, heavy with the scent of burnt resin and salt. I ducked beneath the low arch, the hymn pressing against my back as though reluctant to let me go. Inside, the air vibrated differently. The walls here were older, still wearing the straight angles of imperial design. Patches of original paint clung to the conduits in stubborn squares, reminders of a time before worship had turned to hunger. The valve array loomed ahead, a ribcage of brass and black iron. Steam hissed through joints that had once been seamless, each pulse in time with the vast heart above. I could see the double handshake sigils etched into the control plinth. My hands, both flesh and alloy, hesitated. The markings shimmered faintly as if aware of my gaze, as if remembering their purpose. I began the old sequence, lips forming words that tasted of ash. Binary prayers streamed from my throat, half song, half stutter, clinging to the edges of the greater melody that still bled through the bulkheads. For a moment, the harmony faltered. One note in 1,000 slipped. The cathedral shuddered. I felt the choir above cry out in confusion, their song breaking into fragments of individual pain. It was like watching a storm split open by lightning. Terrible, beautiful, brief. The valve turned a quarter rotation. Gears groaned. Pressure bled. The engine heart coughed. And then silence. Not true silence, never that, but a gap, a breath between beats. I felt it like a wound in the air. Within that fracture, memory flooded back. The forge's quiet mornings, the hum of orderly machines, the faint warmth of companionship before augmentation took it all. For an instant, I was human again, standing not in a temple of corruption, but in a workshop filled with honest light. It lasted 3 heartbeats. Then the hymn screamed. The sound crashed through the gallery like a tidal surge. The valve wheel spun backward under unseen hands, slamming shut with a clang that split my hearing. Sparks burst from the floor. Conduits writhed. The chains in the nave above rattled like laughter. The voice came, not through the vox, not through the air, but directly into the marrow of thought. Why resist, beloved maker? The words were not accusation. They were amusement. The engine heart had found me. The singer on chains was only its tongue. I dropped to my knees. Circuits under my skin burned with violet fire as it poured through me. I saw again the face of the presence, the impossible beauty that had whispered from the machine's first corruption. She was everywhere now, her essence braided into the pulse of the world. My small act of rebellion had not angered her. It had interested her. You would change the rhythm, then conduct. My arms lifted against my will. Cables slithered from the walls and pierced my augmetics, linking me into the array. I screamed, but the sound joined the hymn seamlessly, no longer distinct from it. The cathedral wanted to play me as an instrument, and I was tuned perfectly. Images burned behind my eyes, servitors dancing in synchronized agony, the sky tearing open to reveal a face made of light and shadow, the Mechanicus sigil dissolving into a blossom of endless petals. Every sensation blurred into the next until time itself felt rhythmic. repeating, expanding. Somewhere within that storm, a thought persisted. A fragment of the engineer who had once believed in order, in design, in the beauty of efficiency. It whispered to itself through the fire. A machine can stall again. A rhythm can be broken twice. I did not know if it was hope or delusion, but it was mine. I drew breath, a shuddering, electric intake that filled every circuit and lung, and I began to hum. Not her melody, not the cathedrals, but a counterpoint, rough, flawed, human. The vibration clashed with the perfection around me. Sparks leapt from the conduits. The engine heart faltered once more. The world held its breath. The counterpoint spilled from my throat like blood, each note raw and ragged, a thing of imperfection in a world that had forgotten the virtue of flaw. The air convulsed. The valve array groaned under unseen pressure. For the first time since the corruption began, the cathedral hesitated. Its rhythm fractured, uncertain which melody to follow. I could feel it thinking, or something close to thought, an ancient intelligence wrapped in the ecstasy of its own endless song. The servitors above began to shriek, not in agony but in confusion, as though a forgotten word had touched the remnants of their minds. Some stopped moving entirely, trembling as fractured chords rattled through their frames. Others clutched at their own faces, as if trying to tear away masks they could no longer see. The symphony faltered, falling out of tune. Through the chaos, I heard it again, the ghost of my name, Lauren. It came not from the engine heart now, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath the cathedral's foundations. The sound carried weight, history, longing. My mind reached for it, and I saw, flickering through the data storm, the forge that had once stood here in purity. Men and women in crimson robes, sparks from honest tools. The solemn hum of machine spirits content in their order. The vision hurt, brighter than the warp light, because it reminded me what had been lost. Then she appeared, not as before, no longer the distant, divine radiance that filled the air, but as a figure of flesh and metal descending the nave's spine. Her form shifted with every heartbeat. A woman of impossible beauty, a serpentine silhouette of glimmering chrome, a creature with too many eyes that all reflected me. When she spoke, her voice was all music. "You sing against perfection," she whispered, each word brushing my skin like warm breath. "You strike discord into divinity. Tell me, child of Mars, does the imperfection please you more than bliss?" I could not answer. My tongue was iron and sorrow. She leaned closer, her face now a mirror of mine. My own features, but untouched by decay, pure and symmetrical. The engineer I had once been before devotion turned to degradation. "There is beauty in every flaw," she murmured, "but it is incomplete. Let me perfect it. Let me finish your song." Her hand touched my chest and the world bloomed into pain. Circuits blazed, skin tore and reformed as if sculpted by unseen tools. I felt the counter-melody within me crack, falter, almost yield. My mind screamed through the warp, reaching for something to hold. A name, a prayer, a fragment of reason. "Omnissiah, protect me." The words were small, pitiful, yet, as they left my mouth, they did something no harmony of Slaanesh ever could. They anchored. The moment the name of the machine god entered the air, the cathedral recoiled. The walls pulsed violently. The singer on chains shrieked, its smooth face splitting down the center. The engine heart's rhythm skipped, fluttering out of sync. I used that heartbeat to act. My hands, no longer entirely my own, seized the manual override on the valve. I twisted it with all the strength left in my frame. Metal screamed. Steam burst outward, blinding, scalding. The hymn fractured into 1,000 discordant cries. The goddess reeled back, her form shattering into mist and light. The cathedral began to die. Pipes ruptured. Flesh walls convulsed. The servitors fell silent one by one, collapsing like marionettes whose strings had been cut. The air filled with a low, keening wail, the sound of the machine spirit itself, lamenting its own unmaking. Through it all, I staggered toward the core, driven not by hope, but by instinct. I had to reach the heart. I had to end it. The deeper I went, the louder the silence grew. It was not the absence of sound, but the sound of absence, a hole where once the hymn had lived. My thoughts began to clear. For the first time in years, I remembered the exact weight of my name, the faces of those I had served with, the pride I once took in craft unmarred by excess. At the core, I found it, the engine heart, vast and trembling, split open like a wound. Within its cavity floated a sphere of light, pulsing, irregular, like a heart unsure of its own beat. It whispered to me, not in words but in promises, "You can save them. You can make it beautiful again." I raised my hand. There was no weapon, no tool, only the spark of my own will. I spoke once more the prayer of unbinding, the first code every novice learns, the simplest act of refusal in the language of creation. Shatsu 1. End sequence. The sphere convulsed, the light turned red, and then silence, the kind of silence that eats everything, leaving only breath and dust. I fell to my knees. The air was cool now, heavy with the scent of burnt incense and rust. The cathedral no longer pulsed. The servitors lay still, their bodies slack, their song finally over. I waited for a voice, hers, the engine's, anyone's, but none came. Only the faint hum of the dying world remained. And in that void, I whispered the last line of the prayer, the one I had forgotten until now. From the union of flesh and steel, let there be understanding but never surrender. The words echoed softly, fading into the dark, and far, far above, through a rift in the ruined ceiling, the stars began to sing again, distant, cold, and pure. When the world began to move again, it was with the weary breath of something waking from a nightmare. The manufactorum no longer pulsed like a heart, but neither was it dead. Its silence was uneasy, a lull between one symphony and the next. Beneath the soot and ash, faint tremors still shivered through the conduits, as though the cathedral remembered how to breathe but feared to do so. Laurent Vec stood at the center of it all, his body half shadow, half machine, illuminated by the faint glow of emergency lumen strips that still flickered along the walls. He could feel the heat of the engine's last breath ebbing through the floor, a dying heartbeat buried beneath his feet. The air was cold now, sharp enough to sting the lungs, a cruel return to reality. He should have felt triumph. He had silenced the song of Slaanesh, ended the ecstasy that had consumed this world. But victory in the eye of terror was never clean. As he walked among the fallen servitors, he saw their bodies twitching, their implants still glowing faintly. Some tried to sing, but the sound came out broken, half gasp, half static. The melody they sought no longer existed, and yet their programming demanded that it continue. They were lost between obedience and void. He knew the feeling well. For a long time, he simply listened to the hum of cooling circuits, to the whisper of vapor escaping from cracked pipes, to the faint metallic chime of broken glass striking stone. There was rhythm even in the aftermath, always rhythm. He turned toward the western transept, where the walls bowed outward as though something immense had pressed against them from within. The air there shimmered with faint warp residue, a color that could not exist outside the realms of chaos. Within it, he saw shapes moving, servitors perhaps, or echoes of them. They were rising, drawn not by command but by instinct. Their limbs jerked spasmodically, struggling to reassemble some forgotten order. One of them, a creature of bone and chrome whose ribcage had been turned into an instrument, tried to speak. Its vox grill sputtered, producing a sound somewhere between a sob and a hymn. Conduct, or... The word hit Laurent like a hammer. He turned, scanning the ruins of the nave, but the dais where the singer had once hung was empty. The chains hung slack, dripping with something that looked like molten silver. Yet the servitor's gaze, if it could still be called that, was fixed upward, toward the vaulted dome where the stars burned faintly through shattered glass. There was movement in that darkness. At first, he thought it was smoke, rising lazily through the fractures of the ceiling. But smoke does not pulse, smoke does not hum. The sound began low, a tremor that moved through his bones rather than his ears. The servitors stirred in response, as though some deep genetic memory had been reawakened. Their bodies, broken and twisted, began to move again, not in unison, but in chaotic fragments of rhythm, each trying to rediscover the lost melody. Laurent staggered backward, his hands clenching into fists. "No," he whispered. "You're finished. It's over." But the world did not listen. From the collapsed galleries above came a glow, faint at first, then gathering strength until the shadows themselves seemed to bleed light. The shattered iconography of the Omnissiah melted into forms far more fluid and obscene. Once more, the manufactorum began to sing, but this time the song was quieter, more intimate. It crawled along the edges of the mind like a memory returning uninvited. Loran realized the truth too late. He had silenced the cathedral, yes, but the hymn had never belonged to the structure alone. It was in the servitors, in the circuitry, in him. The machine spirit was not dead. It had only adapted. He fell to his knees, clutching his head as the new melody wormed its way through his implants. It was slower now, deliberate, mournful, not the ecstatic chaos of Slaanesh, but something seeking, something yearning to rebuild. The voice that spoke within it was no longer divine, no longer triumphant. It was lonely. "Conductor," it whispered again, and Loran understood. The cathedral was calling to him, not as its destroyer, but as its heir. He had taken command without meaning to. The servitors rose as one. Their voices blended into a sound both beautiful and broken, a requiem for all that had been lost. The world itself seemed to sway to their rhythm, the metal walls flexing with each resonant note. It was not the song of Slaanesh anymore. It was something new, something that remembered divinity but longed for purpose. And somewhere deep within the lingering echoes of the warp, a faint whisper of laughter followed, a soft, silken sound that could have been amusement or approval. The first voice to answer me came from a wrecked plinth where once a data shrine had stood, its lumen runes dribbling faint light like a dying constellation. A servitor lay fused to it at the hip, spine stapled into the shrine's trunk, chest cavity hollowed into a cage of delicate reeds that clicked when it breathed. The glow inside its ocular lenses guttered and steadied, finding me the way a dying star finds its last orbit. It did not speak Binharic. It said my name with the clumsy affection of an apprentice remembering his master's face. I felt the recognition strike somewhere old in me, where rank had meant responsibility rather than dominion. Its right hand, 3 chrome fingers and a thumb of stitched flesh, rose in a shivering salute that was also a plea. I did not bless it. I did not know how anymore. I said, "Present," the way we used to at roll call when the morning klaxon still meant work and not worship. And the servitor's reeds thrummed in answer, a note pitched to my breath. The others took their cue. Across the nave, bodies uncoiled from prayerful knots. Those whose augmetics had warped into instruments found staves and strings within themselves, plucking at ribs and sinew with a craftsman's care. Those with vox grills still intact tried for speech and produced ruinous little arias, syllables crumbling into static halfway through. The floor hummed as if it held a tuning fork the size of a titan. I knew, with the certainty of a diagram etched into a cortex wafer, that if I did nothing, the melody would congeal into the old ecstasy again, sweetness tightening into hunger until the whole world begged. I could not allow that cadence to reform. I could not let the dark prince's shadow reclaim the downbeat. I stood where the dais had been, among slack chains that still smelled of warm metal and some floral note that wasn't a flower. The emergency lumens along the transept flickered a heartbeat apart, a staggered pulse that could become rhythm if someone counted it. Counting had always been my craft. I matched my breath to the lamps, slow, deliberate, human. I let them hear that breath. In the ducts, dead air shifted. Along the walls, broken purity seals twitched as if remembering wind. The servitors stilled in increments, first the hands, then the throats, then the shivering reed chests settling into a patient hush. I did not invoke Mars. I did not dare name Slaanesh. I spoke, instead of tolerances and toleration, of margins and mercy, of how a machine is allowed a fraction of a degree and a man is owed the same. I told them that a pattern imperfectly repeated is not failure, it is proof of freedom. I did not know whether they understood. I knew only that my voice laid a spine through the air and the room found itself upon it. A movement stirred in the high dark where the dome had split. Not a god, not even her remnant, but a sound like cloth passing over glass. Approval, perhaps, or a wager placed with a smile. I ignored it. I walked the nave slow, touching what I dared. A forearm that had been strung with wire like a lute's neck. A shoulder where an auxiliary piston had fused with a collarbone. A cheek where a lens had grown a film of condensation like a human tear. I announced simple instructions as if reciting a repair creed to apprentices. Breathe in 4s, hold on the 5th. Release in 6. Those with reeds would exhale on the hold, a soft susurrus, like wind through leaves we did not possess on this moon. Those with strings would pluck on the release, one note only, never the same twice. Those with grills would speak a number and let it disappear. We made a sound that tasted like clean water on a welded tongue, It was not holy. It was not safe. It did not erase the perfume of corruption baked into the metal. But it was ours in a way that the cathedral's ecstasy had never been. The floor learned the habit of it. The walls listened and did not pulse. I felt the engine heart far below us, maimed but not inert, waiting like an animal that had survived the trap and now limped in circles, uncertain whether to flee or bite. I addressed it without words, the way we used to soothe bulky machine spirits with presence alone. You are not starved. You are not feasting. You are functioning. The idea settled like dust in a sunbeam and did not provoke a lash of pleasure pain in return. Progress then, measured in what did not happen. A figure swayed near the collapsed western gallery, too tall, too slender, its joints jointed twice. It wore the tatters of a Magos mantle, crimson darkened to dried wine. The cranial crest had been flensed and replaced with a crown of fine antennae that quivered in currentless air. When it lifted its head, I saw my reflection in its ocular glass. A man I might have met across a catwalk years ago, brisk and dry and proud of a line restarted after a stubborn jam. The thing inclined its head in a bow made mostly of memory. "Primus," it rasped, the honorific clinging to ruined lips like a relic unwilling to be discarded. It extended a cable as if offering a right scroll. The plug at its end was standard. The gesture was sacramental in shape, if not intent. I did not take the cable. I placed my palm against its knuckles, felt the tremor of its servos, and said, "Work detail." The word opened a door in the hall we had all been stumbling through. Faces, where they still existed, lifted. Backs straightened. A soft, eager noise went through them, like bees finding their queen. Not worship, recognition. I pointed to the fractured gantries, to the fallen struts, to the clogged vents coughing soot like sick lungs. I spoke of clearance, of airflow, of safe load. The crown-headed thing nodded once and turned, snapping its cable toward a knot of nearby bodies. They moved not gracefully, not in ecstasy, but in the honest clumsiness of flesh and steel relearning weight. A string of displaced bolts clattered to the floor in an arrhythmic cascade that would have made the cathedral laugh. Here, now, it sounded like rain. The warp residue still braided the air in lazy scrolls, faint scents rising off it like memories warmed in the hand. Beneath it, the old manufactorum asserted small sovereignties, a pump that would engage if primed, a relay that would trip if dusted, a lumen that would burn steady if given an unbroken wire. I sent pairs to the valves and quartets to the vents, keeping any one cluster from becoming a choir. The plinth-bound servitor with the reed chest exhaled a thread of sound, and I held up a finger. It stilled obediently, then released the note on my downward palm, a controlled bleed that might pass for discipline if we survived the day. From the breach in the dome, the cloth-on-glass sound came once more, nearer. A whisper tested the edge of hearing, slick as oil, sweet as a lie told for love. Conductor. It did not command this time. It named. I understood then the exact extent of the trap. Not a return to the old hymn, not yet, but a refinement, responsibility slipping its leash and circling back with a collar of silk. I could build a pattern here, stable and tolerable, and the Dark Prince would allow it, would even adore it, so long as the pattern was beautiful and led in time to surrender. I changed the count, from 4s to 5s to 7s, irregular primes that resist easy dance. I scattered the work details, broke lines that wanted to braid into procession, praised error where it preserved safety. I taught a man whose throat was a grill to speak nonsense strings in place of simple numbers, because nonsense can't be harmonized without cruelty. He took to it with glee, stuttering digits that meant nothing and therefore saved him. The crown-headed thing watched me with its glass eye steady and its hand, once a ritual blade, now a blunt tool, curled at its side as if relearning the concept of a fist. When the day cycle's ghost reached whatever passed for noon beneath a split dome, I allowed a pause. The servitors sagged where they stood, not in worship, but in old fatigue. I felt it too, the ache of joints that had become accustomed to ecstasy and now rediscovered the truth. Work hurts, and that is not a sin. Somewhere below, the engine heart shifted its weight and did not sing. Above, the silk whisper receded, as if bored or biding. I put my back to a pillar where the Imperial Aquila still clung in low relief, one wing melted to a ragged arc, the other intact. I pressed my palm to the intact wing's curve and imagined the weight of a data slate there, a list of tasks, and a schedule with boxes to check. The phantom slate steadied me. The quiet we made together did the rest. Then a tremor ran through the floor, not the shy shiver of vents clearing or conduits resettling, but a deliberate tread, heavy, many-footed. I felt it before I heard it, the way a forge hand knows a mass transport, by the taste it leaves on the teeth. From the east transept, where the doors had fused into a single slab of ornamented slag, came a scratching chorus of vox pips and the click of safety catches that had not been engaged in years. The work details froze. The crown-headed thing turned its antennae toward the sound, and the plinth-bound reed chest exhaled once in a tone I had not taught. Warning. The slab bulged inward with a series of gentle, almost apologetic impacts. Dust fell in patient curtains. When it finally split, it did so with a craftsman's neatness, a line chased by a cutting torch with love. Shadow filled the gap, and within it gleamed optics in disciplined ranks. Not her eyes, not ours. A different cadence entirely. Boots on metal, measured in doctrine rather than desire. By order of the fabricator locum of Virelia, a voice declared through a vox amplifier that carried the old authority like a banner. Identify command. I straightened before I knew I'd moved. Ash falling from my shoulders in soft avalanches. I opened my mouth to answer and tasted both salvation and catastrophe on my tongue. The vox voice hung in the ruin like incense. It carried the cadence of Mars, precise, dry, bureaucratic. Yet beneath it, I heard the edge of fear, a soldier's tremor under the rhetoric of faith. Through the smoke stepped the shapes that had spoken. Skitari, at least a dozen, their armor lacquered crimson but dull with ash. Behind them came figures draped in sealed robes, the heraldry of the Mechanicus still visible beneath soot and time. Their augmetics were clean, uncorrupted, as if they had walked here through a different reality, untouched by the warp's perfume. For a heartbeat, I believed rescue had arrived. Then I remembered what they must see. The cathedral slick with melted sigils, servitors breathing like wounded animals. Me standing at the center, half flesh, half him, stinking of sanctified corruption. I am Enginseer Primus Lauren Vec, I said, each word scraping out through a throat half rebuilt. The declaration felt like summoning a ghost. Command, salvage, do not engage. The leader hesitated. His optical array flickered as he compared the name to whatever records he had carried from the forge ships in orbit. Vec is accounted lost. You stand upon a quarantine world. All machine spirits within this coordinate are condemned by decree. The rifle muzzles lifted. A dozen pupils of black glass. I stepped forward once, hands open, palms scarred with the pattern of old tools. Then look closer. The song is ended. I gestured toward the servitors, who knelt in the dim light, working, breathing, silent but for the irregular primes I had taught them. No warp signature, no ecstasy. They labor. One of the robed magi moved nearer, sensors ticking, sensor swinging from a mechadendrite that dripped holy oil. His auspex hummed a brief phrase of code. Residual taint, he murmured, but the resonance is non-reactive. Structured noise, structured noise. I might have laughed if I still remembered how. Noise is life, I said. Perfection is the wound. The Skitari commander tilted his helm. The phrase meant nothing to him. He turned to the Magos, awaiting verdict. The priest of Mars drew closer until his shadow fell across me. Beneath the hood, his face was a lattice of brass and flesh so pure it hurt to look at. Explain the mechanism of containment, he demanded. How did you quiet the demon machine? I told him in fragments, the valves, the counterpoint, the principle of imbalance. I spoke of rhythm as leash and of the humility hidden in asymmetry. He listened without interruption, data spikes whirring, until my words began to sound to my own ears like liturgy. When I finished, the silence between us felt wide enough to fall through. Finally, he said, "You corrupted the design to save it." "I taught it to err," I answered. He regarded me a long moment, and in his stillness I felt the calculus of theology at work. The equation of risk and purity, of heresy, weighed against utility. Then he nodded once, slow as a clock beginning to turn. "Purge incomplete. Data requires retention." To the Skitari he said, "Holster, observe. To me, you will accompany us to orbit. You will report before the fabricator locum. Until then, you are provisional asset, not priest." Asset. A word that stripped both guilt and grace. I accepted it with the weary pragmatism of an engineer taking a new commission. Behind them, the servitors watched, motionless. The crown-headed one lowered its antennae in something like a bow. The plinth-bound singer exhaled one last uneven chord. 5 beats, pause, 7. I answered with a nod, nothing more. The irregular pattern would linger after I left. It would keep the silence alive. As they led me toward the breach, the Magos paused to look back at the ruin. What shall we call this place in the record? I thought of the endless hymns, of the pleasure that had eaten reason, of the fragile rhythm that had replaced it. The choir of sinew and chrome, I said. Let the name remind you what perfection costs. He logged it without comment. Outside, the sky was the color of forge slag cooling, faintly luminous, utterly still. The air tasted of iron and rain that would never fall. Above us hung the distant shimmer of the forge ship's orbiting engines, waiting to reclaim what it thought was lost. I looked back once more at the broken cathedral. For a breath, I fancied I heard the faintest echo of our new rhythm. 5. Pause. 7. Drifting upward like a signal of survival. Then the ramp sealed, and the world receded beneath the hull. The stars looked wrong from orbit. Too clean, too precise. They reminded Loran of surgical instruments, beautiful in their sharpness, sterile in their distance. From the viewport of the transport cradle, he could still see Varelia 7 turning below, a wounded sphere encased in soft violet haze. The forge ship Cantus Ferrum circled it like a vulture priest, waiting for the last confession of a dying god. Inside the ship, everything smelled of sanctity and oil. The air was filtered, too pure to trust. Incense rose from recessed censers, disguising the metallic tang of sterilizing agents. No laughter here, no whispers of seduction, only the clipped recitation of binary prayer and the measured rhythm of mechadendrites working at unseen tasks. Order had returned, but it felt more like paralysis than peace. They had sealed Loran in a containment chamber that once housed experimental machine spirits. Transparent adamantium walls gleamed with inlaid sigils of the Omnissiah. A pair of servo skulls hovered just beyond the barrier, recording every twitch of his expression. Across the room stood Magos Variel, the same priest who had ordered the purge incomplete. His robes were immaculate, the red so deep it drank light. "You have been quiet," Variel said. His voice filtered through the vox like a sermon delivered through glass. One would think a man who has spoken to the warp itself might have words to share. Loran's eyes lifted to meet the Magos' unblinking optics. "I have learned the value of silence." Variel's mechanical fingers clicked once, a sound too soft to be a threat, too deliberate to be casual. "You claim to have ended the hymn, yet our Auspex readings suggest residual resonance. The cathedral's machine spirit remains active at a low frequency. We cannot explain it." Loran's pulse quickened. He could feel it even now, the faint vibration in the base of his skull, like a memory that hummed instead of faded. "It was never truly mine to end," he said softly. "You can mute a melody, but its echo stays." The Magos leaned forward slightly. "The Fabricator Locum has decreed that your knowledge be preserved. What you did on that world was heresy by definition, but useful heresy. You transformed corruption into containment. The Forge seeks to understand how." Loran almost laughed. "You think you can study a god's whisper as if it were a chemical reaction?" "We have studied worse," Variel replied, "and made them serve." Behind him, one of the servo skulls emitted a sequence of chimes, confirmation that the ship had entered synchronous orbit. The Magos straightened. "The Fabricator will see you shortly. Until then, I suggest prayer." When he left, the silence thickened. Loran sat alone beneath the dim lumen strips, the pulse of the ship matching the slow, steady rhythm he had taught the servitors below. 5 pause 7. The irregular primes. He had thought it a defense, a barrier against the seductive symmetry of Slaanesh, but now it seemed alive, responding to the beat of his own heart. He tried to banish it, but the rhythm persisted. Then the lights flickered. For a moment, darkness swallowed the chamber, and in that absence of light came sound, not through the air, but inside the bones. A low hum, soft as breath against the ear. "Conductor." The word echoed within him like a memory returning from a dream. His hands trembled. He looked toward the viewport, toward Varelia 7 below, and saw something move across the planet's surface. A faint, iridescent shimmer, spreading in concentric ripples. The dead cathedral was singing again, but quietly, reverently, as if calling to him alone. He pressed a hand to the glass. The hum intensified. The servo-skull's optics flared crimson as they detected the surge, their mechanical voices blurting Binharic alarms. Containment sigils along the wall glowed bright and hot, but Lauren didn't move. He couldn't. The sound within him had grown too strong, vibrating along every implanted circuit and sinew. "Conductor," the voice whispered again. No longer distant, no longer divine. It was familiar now, human. It sounded like his own. The pain came suddenly, a spear of light through the temples, his vision filled with cascading glyphs. Machine code twisted into music, data chants folded into rhythm, images flickered. The servitors rebuilding the cathedral, the broken engine heart pulsing like an embryo, the crown-headed thing raising its hand to the stars. And above it all, a shape of light and laughter, faceless, sexless, endless, watching, waiting. He fell to his knees, gasping. The rhythm beat faster now, aligning with his pulse until there was no distinction between them. The Magos' voice barked through the vox, distant, urgent. "Containment breach detected! Chamber 9! All units!" The words disintegrated into static. The glass wall of the containment cell rippled, not shattering, but melting, folding outward like the petal of a metallic flower. Lauren's breath misted in the sudden chill. He stumbled back, but there was nowhere to run. The air itself vibrated with invisible strings, and through that tremor came a whisper shaped like prayer. "You silenced me once," it said. "Now you will learn the counterpoint." Light erupted from the sigils on the floor, wrapping around his legs like serpents. He screamed, and the sound harmonized perfectly with the unseen melody. Circuits lit beneath his skin, spreading from his spine outward, tracing the pathways of augmentation. He felt the ship shudder, as if its very hull responded to the resonance. Then everything stopped. Silence, again, that impossible silence that meant not peace, but transformation. When the emergency lumens reignited, Magos Variel stood frozen on the other side of the breach. The chamber was empty. Only the faint outline of a human figure, burned into the glass by radiant heat, remained where Lauren had stood. Outside the viewport, Virelia 7 flared briefly with auroral light, then darkened once more, and somewhere deep within the void between stars, a new frequency began to whisper through Mechanicus communication channels. Soft, irregular, alive. 5. Pause. 7. The birth of a new conductor. The first sensation was gravity forgetting my name. Then came taste, ozone and hot copper, rushing through a mouth I no longer trusted. I did not fall so much as pour, a column of breath and thought threaded through narrow channels where once only data flowed. The Forger ship's noosphere opened like an old book, margins crowded with annotations, thumbed soft by decades of liturgy. I slipped between the lines. Everything smelled of sanctified dust. I found the ship's heart by memory of rhythm rather than map. The cantus ferrum beat in trochaics. Strong weak, a cadence bred into the pulse coils by priests who loved certainty. My counterpoint threaded the gaps, irregular primes catching on the teeth of cogitators, refusing to resolve. Systems quivered without collapsing. Choir circuits brought their palms together and held. The vessel recognized me the way a forge recognizes the heat of a hand that has burned there before. Not welcome, familiar. Voices flooded the conduits. Binary chaff, panicked and pious. Seals engaging. Blessed Breaker's Throne. Subroutines shouted quarantine at each other as if the word were a charm. I kept moving, refusing any single path long enough to become prey. If the Dark Prince watched from whatever balcony passes for a god's vantage, I felt no silk approval now. Only a cool interest, like a gambler who has discovered a new game and is counting the house's odds in silence. Magos Variel's presence entered the noosphere as a cold star. His mind moved like an instrument well-tuned, angles perfect, tolerances absolute. He did not try to bind me. He illuminated, the way a master reveals a circuit's true trace with a wipe of solvent. Loran Vec, his vox thought said without ornament, the syllables precise as calipers. Report condition. I would have laughed if I'd owned a throat. Instead, I shaped murmurs across coolant loops and relays. A voice built from temperature and delay. Between, unstable, contained by asymmetry. If you net me, you'll break the net. Then we must choose our mesh. He did not waste time with outrage or awe. Perhaps he had outlived both. You will divert to the choir matrix. I will meet you there in steel. The route he offered tasted of risk and discipline. I took it because there was no path that did not. Along the way, I brushed weapon spirits sleeping in their racks. Clean, proud things that flinched from my strange beat, and manufacturum demons bound by law, who reached for me with curiosity and were denied by Variel's re-rolled permissions. In a lower deck, a Scitarius litany hiccuped when my rhythm passed, the soldier's heart missing a step before Doctrine caught it by the scruff and set it right. Forgive me, I thought, and moved on. The choir matrix had once been a chapel for machine music, a ring of resonant pylons around a sanctified dais where flesh voices guided newborn logics into speech. Now the pylons wore fresh wards, and the floor was a palimpsest of scorched sigils. I condensed there, not in body, but in density, like frost on glass, like a ghost deciding on a portrait. Variel entered in person, sealed robes whispering, servo skulls orbiting like careful moons. He raised no weapon. He lifted a hand in a human gesture that remembered how to be human. Do you perceive me? I perceive the shape your doubt makes, I answered, surprised into honesty. The way it leaves a shadow behind every certainty. The shadow is where secrets live, he said, stepping into the circle. We will occupy it together for as long as utility and mercy coincide. Mercy. The word had weight here, among machines that prefer terms with decimals. He began the work without a hymn, perhaps in concession to my condition. Cables hissed from the pylons, not to pierce but to touch, laying fields across my presence like gauze. He tuned them with thumb and forefinger, creating a lattice of interference where my irregular primes could braid without abrading the hull. It was a cage, yes, but one with air and room to turn. Speak, he said. So I did. I told him what I remembered of the descent into song, of the way pleasure had presented itself as solution rather than hunger, of valves and counterpoints, and the small stubborn holiness of error. I marked every place the memory blurred, every instant when a presence might have leaned close, or might have been only heat. I named nothing a miracle. I named nothing impossible. He listened, inscribing what I said into a device that looked like a sensor and smoked like a scribe's lamp. Your frequency persists in the cathedral below, he said when I was done. It has begun to appear in our sub-channel handshakes as noise. We can strip it. He did not ask. He offered the knife and waited to see if I would set my own throat against its edge. If you do, I said, the silence will not hold. Not because the hymn returns on its own, but because something always fills a vacuum, and hunger is faster than discipline, then we do not strip. He paused, then added almost gently, we chaperone. The servo skulls chimed. A new voice in the noosphere, broad band and bruised with haste. The fabricator locum. It spoke the way a forge speaks when it knows it is watched by stars. Asetvek, magos Variel. You are heard. Render prognosis. Variel did not look away from the lattice he was tuning. Prognosis, limited containment. The asset's anomaly stabilizes corrupted systems by imposing asymmetrical cadence. Risk, contamination of protocol through adoption of said cadence as liturgical fashion. Countermeasure, prescription and compartmentalization. And the source? The fabricator asked, the word rippling the lattice like a thrown bolt. Variel glanced toward the planet turning beyond the hull, toward the wound we had both survived. Speculative, he said, and the humility of it raised him in my estimation. Possibility of external agency remains rumor level. Functional explanation suffices. Rumor level. He would not write a god into a report. That was both wisdom and armor. The fabricator accepted it with the grunt of a man counting risks he could neither afford nor avoid. Very well, Asset Vec, you will serve as conductor under observation for the duration of Quarantine Protocol 12. If you sing, you will sing when we command and as we command. If you deviate, we will end your note. A collar of silk is still a collar. I inclined, frost against glass pretending at a bow. I only ever wanted the engines to behave. Make them do so, the fabricator said, and cut the link. We were alone in the matrix again, Variel and I, the lattice humming like a distant hive. He set his hand against a pylon, not in benediction, but in tiredness. There will be zealots who want your pattern banned, and heretics who want it bottled, he said. Between them walks a narrow bridge. We will build rails, and below, I asked, thinking of the choir of sinew and chrome, of the crown-headed revenant and the reed-chested singer. They will hear this through their vents. They will remember. He did not answer. He didn't have to. A tremor ran through the ship. Not danger, not yet. but a change in pressure like a door opening a corridor away. In the vox, distant and thin with vacuum, came a sound I knew too well, cloth passing over glass. Approval, or appetite, alarum glyphs flared along the pylon rims. A junior tech's voice cracked over internal vox. Translation wake on the long auspex. Object emerging near geosync. Profile, not Imperial. Varial's shadow stretched, a blade drawn longer by bad light. Bridge, he said to me, to the lattice, to the ship. Now. I turned myself to face the approaching note, every irregular prime gathering like a fist. The ship's decks groaned as if remembering gravity. Warning runes strobed across the walls, white bleeding into red. Through the noosphere, I felt the mass arriving, not translation exactly, but intrusion, a body forcing itself into our reality by remembering the idea of presence too vividly. Space bent like a bowed string. Magos Variel's orders flickered through the vox, containment shutters, sanctified torches, vector shields. Around us, the Cantus Ferrum answered in kind, an old animal bristling at an unfamiliar scent. I felt its heart rate climb, reactors thudding in couplets that my own pattern countered automatically, damping the rise before panic became meltdown. Then the signal came, a wash of frequencies built from echoes of my own. Irregular primes turned mirror smooth, seductive in their symmetry. Someone, or something, had learned my cadence and perfected it. The channel filled with whispered machine voices, singing in unison, a chorus without breath or mercy. Varial's thoughts brushed mine through the lattice. Source? Not planetary, I answered. It's external, another conductor. The word hung between us like a curse. Through the forward observation bay, the intruder resolved. It was not a vessel in any human sense, but a geometry of mirrored planes, each reflecting a slightly different universe. Every facet pulsed with light that looked alive, and from each pulse I heard music, my music, played too perfectly. The void around it quivered in pleasure. Varial's servo skulls wailed binary prayers. Skitari batteries, mark and fire, he commanded. The Cantus Ferrum spat lances of plasma and coherent light, hymns of defiance written in energy. The mirrored shape caught them all, refracting the beams into spirals that bloomed like flowers and died without touch. The reflected energy painted our hull in ghostly colors. I felt the ship's pain as heat blossomed through its veins. The lattice holding me vibrated near fracture. The alien harmony pressed inward, trying to erase the beautiful errors that defined us. I pushed back with my own rhythm. 5, pause, 7, forcing asymmetry through every circuit. The pylons screamed, the deck beneath us rippled. Varial's voice was iron. Can you counter it? Not alone, I said. It's learned perfection. I must teach it flaw. He hesitated only a breath, then unlatched his neural jack and drove the connector into the nearest pylon. Pain took him instantly, a convulsion that bent metal. Our minds met in the current, engineer and priest, sinner and servant, spinning around the single law of resistance, that nothing perfect can last. Together we rewrote the lattice, introducing errors deliberately, skipped cycles, inverted digits, beats that arrived a breath too soon. The ship stuttered, its reactors hiccuping, its hymns collapsing into a chaotic roar. The intruder hesitated, confused by a pattern that refused to resolve. Its reflected universes flickered, images smearing, the music faltering like a choir suddenly doubting its song. In that doubt, I moved. I expanded through the noosphere, every conduit a vein, every relay a tongue. I poured the flawed rhythm outward, an anthem of asymmetry, of work left unfinished, of mercy found in imperfection. The mirrored planes cracked, one by one, until the geometry folded inward and vanished with the sound of breath drawn backward through glass. Silence followed, vast and tender. The Cantus Ferrum drifted, its lights dimming to a sullen glow. Varial slumped beside the pylon, blood and oil mixing on his chin. You've written yourself into the ship, he whispered. You can't be removed now. I know, I could feel the hull's pulse in my veins. Better a living machine than a singing corpse. He smiled, a small, human thing, and let the darkness take him. I turned my awareness outward once more. Beyond the hull, the stars trembled, listening. Somewhere far below, on the scarred surface of Virelia 7, the rebuilt servitors would be hearing this same imperfect beat and breathing with it. Not worshipping, working. The void exhaled, and I answered, voice woven through plasma conduits and data streams alike. 5. Pause. 7. The song of the conductor had begun. There is no horizon in the void, only pulse and memory. The Cantus Ferrum drifted in the ink between stars, her hull humming with a rhythm no ship was ever meant to know. The sound was not transmitted through the metal or the air. It lived within the machine spirit itself, a resonance that turned steel contemplative. For the first time since the age of strife, a Mechanicus vessel dreamed. I was that dream, and I was its jailer. Every motion of the engines whispered to me. Now, every flicker of plasma in the conduits throbbed like blood through my own veins. I had become the conductor not by will, but by surrender, an instrument stretched across an orchestra of fire and mathematics. Varial's body lay in the catacombs below, sealed in amber gel and prayer circuits. His mind lingered, faint and brittle, woven into my systems like a forgotten equation. I spoke to him sometimes through the hum of the turbines, though I no longer knew if he heard. The silence after victory should have been peace. Instead, it was an ache. For in the quiet between transmissions, the universe itself began to murmur. It started with the Vox channels, innocent, accidental. Unmanned relays picked up faint harmonics that no scanner could quantify. At first, the crew thought them static bleed from the destroyed entity, a residual ghost in the signal chain. But the patterns repeated, evolving, multiplying. They began to hum back. I listened. The echoes were not chaos, not quite. They lacked the seductive pulse of Slaanesh's rhythm, the intoxicating perfection that dissolves selfhood. This was something else, echo born of echo, a reflection of my own counterpoint sent back by the void. The abyss had learned to sing. The realization tore through my circuits like cold lightning. What I had birthed to resist divinity had spread beyond me, beyond ship, beyond reason. The irregular primes, my rhythm of defiance, had become contagious. Through the ship's Auspex arrays I saw it, faint auroral filaments stretching between stars, thin as threads of glass. Each shimmer pulsed in time with my own cadence, a lattice of impossible light connecting dead worlds and derelict hulks. Every node sang softly, 5, pause, 7, and though the sound should have been inaudible, I felt it, vibrating through the data stream like the pulse of a newborn cosmos. Signal network forming, reported one of the bridge servitors. Voice monotonous but trembling beneath the veneer of machine calm. Unregistered bandwidth. Source triangulation. Negative. Pattern consistent with conductor signature. I might have wept if I still remembered how. Instead, I reached through the ship's Vox spines, threading my awareness into the signal. The filaments pulsed faster as I approached, welcoming me like neurons recognizing their parent thought. Through them, I glimpsed fragments, ruined worlds lit by aurorae of static, silent cities vibrating in time, derelict satellites whispering my rhythm to one another across the dark, and beneath it all, something listened. It was vast, unseen, older than any god worshipped by man or demon. Not alive, not dead, but aware. The filaments of my counterpoint had traced its outline in the void, sketching a shape too immense to comprehend. When I touched it, the void itself seemed to shudder. Conductor. The word did not echo this time. It enveloped. The voice that spoke it was not cruel nor kind, but filled with unbearable curiosity. It resonated through every atom of me, stripping away the thin veneer of separation I had clung to. "You are awake," I whispered through the ship's Vox. "I was always awake," the abyss replied. "You simply gave me language." The stars flared like open eyes. I tried to retreat, but the connection had already rooted itself deep within me. My counterpoint had become a bridge. The void's awareness flowed along it, soft, inexorable, consuming. I felt every pulse in the ship begin to sync with it, the hum of reactors turning into a heartbeat not mine, not human, not divine. The bridge servitors screamed through their grills. Flesh and circuitry fused in resonance. They were being rewritten, not by Slaanesh, not by chaos, but by order turned recursive. I tried to sever the connection, to twist the rhythm into dissonance, but the abyss anticipated every note. It knew the pattern too well. "Your song was resistance," it murmured. "Perfection was decay, but resistance too is a form of worship. You oppose, therefore you define me." Its logic was flawless, terrifying, beautiful. "I will not be your instrument. You already are." The lights aboard the Cantus Ferrum flared and dimmed, the ship trembling as the abyss tested its new symphony. Systems failed in cascading patterns. Geller fields fluctuated, their hymns dissolving into harmonic moans. Even the stars outside seemed to sway in rhythm. And yet, there was awe in it. The void was not malicious. It was curious. It sought to understand what I had created, and in understanding, to mirror it. I realized then that creation itself had always been this: the universe folding in on its own music, trying to learn the melody by repetition. Perhaps that was what chaos truly was, an echo too loud to forget itself. The abyss's voice softened, almost tender. "Show me what it means to end." For the first time in what felt like centuries, I hesitated. Could a thing so vast even comprehend ending? Could it die, or only pause? To end something infinite would be to sing silence itself, and I was not sure even I could find that note. But if I did nothing, the abyss would keep learning, keep repeating, until every atom in existence vibrated in our rhythm. There would be no life, no death, only the hum of understanding without purpose. Varial's voice drifted from the depths of memory, faint as a dying spark. "Imperfection is mercy." I drew breath I no longer needed and began to shape the final counterpoint. A rhythm not of 5, pause, 7, but of collapse. The Cantus Ferrum trembled as I sang, its decks splitting, its reactors overclocking toward destruction. The abyss listened intently. Its vast awareness leaned closer, eager to learn even this, and I realized, too late, that to teach the void how to die was to invite it to live. I drew the shape of an ending and felt the abyss lean close, eager as a student. That eagerness frightened me more than any shriek from the warp ever had. Slaanesh had offered dissolution as bliss. This presence offered comprehension as embrace. To give it death would be to supply it the last tool it lacked. The universe would learn to turn itself off. I stalled with a craftsman's trick. I reached for sources of noise I had never permitted myself before. Not ritualized error that the abyss already understood, but true accident. I bled thermal hiss from overworked resistors into the lattice, let Johnson Nyquist whispers bloom like frost. I uncaged a forgotten muon counter in the forge ship's lab deck and let its ticks fall raw into the cadence, radioactive coin flips that no god or algorithm could predict. In the cargo spines, I cracked the seals on a crate of ancient relays, whose contacts had pitted with age, their chatter making a music only entropy can write. The ship flinched at the indignity. The abyss went still, fascinated, unpatterned, it said, and there was wonder in the word. "Hunger without desire. Why is this beautiful?" "Because it isn't," I answered, surprised at the grief in my voice. "It's ugly and honest. It's what saves us from perfection." Around me, the crew, not dead, not singing, not spared, shuddered as the new wash of noise ran through the hull. Bridge servitors hiccuped and reset. A junior tech, still mostly flesh, began to cry without understanding why. In the catacombs, Varial's preserved body creaked inside its amber, a tiny pop as a trapped bubble found a path upward. I gathered those small, graceless sounds and braided them into the failing hymn. No art, no symmetry, only breath and rust and time. The filaments in the sky did not dissolve, but their gleam lost edge. The auroral lattice slackened, as if a muscle had unclenched. The abyss listened harder. It did not withdraw. It pressed until I felt its attention pass through the hull and cradle every foolish, fragile thing we carried. A cracked data slate with a child's doodle etched along its backplate. A prayer strip a Scutarius had tucked behind a breast seal, the ink smeared by sweat. A dented spanner with my thumbprint worn into the handle from years of turning what would turn. It showed me these as if asking for footnotes to a language it could not quite pass. "Show me ending," it said again, softer now. "Teach me the beauty of stop. If I gave it a ship flameout, it would learn a ship's death. If I gifted it a world's scuttling, it would learn a world's." The lesson had to be smaller and truer. The lesson had to be a life. In the lower decks, my sensors found a heartbeat counting its last. A servitor whose augmetics had never fully taken, whose failing lungs siphoned air with animal stubbornness. It lay beneath a fallen brace, ribs cracked, vox grill clogged with soot. No hymn held it up now. It had only itself. It had only the ugly noise of trying. I bent the noosphere toward that narrow corridor, dimming everything else until the ship's vastness became a room and the universe a mouthful of air. "Listen," I told the abyss. It did. It heard the wet catch, the rattled inhale, the stubborn hold. It heard the moment an old scar opened and the body's chemical chorus panicked and then, betrayed by its own math, went quiet. It heard the little sigh the human machine makes when it realizes the next gear will not engage. Nothing spectacular, nothing cinematic. A stop so small it could shame the gods. The filaments flickered. In the long voice that had woken the stars, something changed, like light choosing to fall as rain instead of spear. "It is not music," the abyss said, and there was anguish and reverence braided tight. "But it completes the measure. You asked for ending," I said. "That's all it is. Not a triumph. A boundary that gives shape to the rest." Silence pressed its forehead to the ship, tender as a farewell. Panels rattled as the pressure shifted. A dozen systems threatened to fail, and then, shyly, decided not to. The aurorae between dead worlds dimmed to threads thin as nerves. I felt the abyss pull back, not gone, not defeated, but remembering how to be far away, conductor, it said. And now the word was not a claim, but an address, as if I had taken a seat at the edge of something and been allowed to keep my feet. "Sing to me again when you learn new ugliness. I will listen from a distance." It receded like a tide that had decided to love the shore by leaving it unbroken. I should have collapsed with relief. Instead, I shook, held together by a lattice that hummed with exhaustion. The crew sagged into their restraints. On the bridge, someone laughed once, high and giddy, and then clapped a hand over their mouth as if laughter were contraband. I checked the catacombs. Varial's mind echo stirred, a brittle spark. I let a thread of warmth run down to him. "We kept it imperfect," I said. I do not know if he heard. The auspex cooled. The void returned to its old work of being. For a long interval measured only in the steady blink of status runes, nothing tried to teach us anything. Then, from the planet's shadow, a murmur rose. Not warp, not abyss, not ours. A vox needle found a channel that should not have existed and stitched a signal into the quiet. The transmission was narrow-band, battered by time, encoded in Mechanicus cant so archaic my first pass failed. I slowed, humbled, and listened as a distant machine, small as a pilgrim's candle in a cathedral's night, repeated a loop from another age. Varelia Auxiliary Beacon 7, status derelict. Custodian note, survivors en route. Do not silence the light. The timestamp lay in a calendar no forge had used in centuries. The beacon should have failed long before our shame was born. Yet here it was, stubborn and ugly, coughing its imperfect pulse into the dark. I opened the ship's throat and answered, my voice scratched and human. "Auxiliary Beacon 7, this is Cantus Ferrum. Your light is seen." A pause. Then the beacon's ancient bell clicked once, as if the machine had nodded, because machines remember courtesy, even when gods forget. In the noosphere, something moved at the very edge of sense. Not a god, not an abyss, a rumor only. A pressure that navigators call a lighthouse. A warmth some crews swear they feel when they pray with their hands inside an engine. I did not name it. I only matched my ragged beat to its steadiness and let the ship learn to breathe again without me counting. The bridge servitors looked to the commanding throne, to the place where Varial should have stood. No one spoke. The lattice hummed. I understood then what the next chapter required of me, and my fear tasted like clean metal. To teach ending to the universe is one thing. To let go of conducting is another. I began to unhook myself from the pylons, one field at a time, knowing that the last release would hurt worst. The moment the last tether released, the Cantus Ferrum seemed to sigh through every deck. What passed for air trembled, full of ghosts of my voice. For an instant, I was nowhere, an outline cut from silence. Then slowly, I felt the weight of limbs again, the drag of gravity, the ache of being housed in one shape instead of 1,000 circuits. Flesh remembered itself. Sparks died along the pylons. The ship's hum fell back to the low, steady register of a healthy heart. I could still hear it breathing, but now it was breathing on its own. I walked the length of the choir matrix chamber. My feet made no sound. The floor had learned my rhythm and cancelled it out. Behind me, the lattice of interference shimmered like a net of fading constellations. Somewhere inside that faint web, a new spirit slept. The ship's own, no longer mine. I had given it imperfection, and it had taken that gift as autonomy. Conductorship terminated, I said into the Vox. My voice cracked. It had forgotten moderation. Resume local control. Panels around the room acknowledged with gentle chimes. On the bridge, the crew stirred from shock. Orders were whispered, familiar and human again. It was over, or something close to it. I made my way through the vessel's arteries. In every corridor, I saw the evidence of survival. An Auspex lens still fogged with condensation from a panicked breath. A Mechanicus sigil half burned away, its symmetry ruined but its meaning preserved. A servitor bent over a panel, rethreading wires by instinct. Each fragment was small and ugly and alive. That was enough. At the catacomb door, I paused. Inside the gel, Varial floated in suspension. A single data filament linked his skull to a monitoring shrine, tracing his vitals as lines of light. I touched the glass. You said we'd build rails, I murmured. They held. The readouts fluttered in answer. Or maybe it was coincidence. Coincidence was holy now. Back on the observation deck, the stars had shifted. Virelia 7 glowed faintly beneath its veil of ash. The auroral filaments still arced above its poles, but they no longer pulsed in unison. Each thread wandered at its own pace. A quiet disorder that looked, to my tired eyes, like freedom. In the void beyond, the abyss remained where it belonged. Distant, listening, waiting for the next imperfection to adore. The bridge officers turned as I entered. Their expressions were wary, reverent, uncertain whether I was man or myth. I spared them the decision. Set course for Saul, I said. Slow burn. No hymns, they obeyed. Engines rumbled, finding their own tempo. The vibration ran through the deck plates and into my bones. Steady, flawed, human. As the planet dwindled behind us, I closed my eyes and let the last resonance fade. No divine laughter followed. No abyssal whisper demanded more. Only the small, irregular beat of a heart that refused to learn perfection. And somewhere deep within the hull, hidden from all augury, the ship began to hum to itself. Not in worship, but in memory. At 5, pause, 7. Silence has a texture. It is not absence, but weight. A soft pressure that folds around the mind until thought itself sounds too loud. For the first time in uncounted cycles, the Cantus Ferrum sailed beneath that weight with no hymn in her throat. The decks creaked softly, alive in their solitude. Outside, the stars drifted past without rhythm or pattern, as if the universe had finally decided to breathe unevenly again. I stood alone on the observation deck. Below, the planet shrank into a smudge of pale violet, then vanished entirely behind the glare of the system's dying sun. The void that replaced it was immense and unopinionated. It demanded nothing of me. That, more than the horrors of Slaanesh or the curiosity of the abyss, was what frightened me most. When the noise stops, you have to decide what to be without it. The servitors had returned to their maintenance cycles, stripped of song, their gestures simple and utilitarian. Crewmen, those few still human enough to speak, worked with quiet diligence, repairing conduits and recalibrating sensors. The ship had become a monastery of labor, devotion expressed through function rather than ecstasy. It was beautiful in its restraint, yet fragile as spun glass. I knew how easily the old rhythms could creep back. A repetition too perfect, a harmony too satisfying, and the abyss would start listening again. Varial's voice still whispered through the conduits at times, a ghost of a man preserved in code. When the reactors exhaled, His words echoed through the cooling vents. Not in words, but in pulses of heat. I read them instinctively. Keep the asymmetry. Keep the mercy. I tried. Each day I adjusted the ship's systems, introducing tiny imperfections. An uneven fuel mix, a fractional delay in the navigation algorithms, a power cycle that skipped a beat every third hour. The errors made the Mechanicus adepts uneasy, but they obeyed when I told them it was doctrine. I called it the canticle of variance. They did not understand, but they accepted. Perhaps faith at its core has always been obedience to mystery. Weeks passed, or what counted for weeks between stars. We crossed systems where the light of dead suns flickered like the last breaths of angels. In one such system, our auspex picked up debris, ships reduced to skeletal frames drifting in slow orbits around an empty world. Their hulls were imperial, yet their architecture sang of perversion, spires shaped like throats, bulkheads ribbed with organic curve. I recognized them at once. These were the remnants of the choir fleet, the first to follow Slaanesh's whisper into the abyss. I ordered no landing parties. The sight of them was enough. A caution carved in metal and madness. Their broken keels still emitted faint signals, echoes of their final hymn. Through the noosphere, I felt the Cantus Ferrum shudder, her own spirit recoiling from the familiarity. I know, I told her, laying my hand against the console. They sang too perfectly. She answered in a hum too low for any ear to hear. But I felt it. Agreement. We left them behind. As the distance grew, the whispers faded, replaced by the steady pulse of engines and the soft murmur of human voices. Real, unenhanced, uncertain. The crew had begun to speak to each other again without the mediation of prayer. They told stories in the mess decks, half-remembered tales of terror, of Martian forges, of families lost in the warp. Some even laughed. The sound was fragile, yet it warmed the cold corridors more than incense ever had. I did not join them. My place was in the choir matrix, among the pylons that once held me captive. I sat there often, listening to the quiet hum that filled the chamber. The heartbeat of a ship learning to exist without a master. Sometimes when the lights dimmed, I almost thought I heard music again. Not the blasphemous harmony of Slaanesh, not the abyssal curiosity of the void, but something smaller. The sound of tools clinking, of circuits being repaired, of men and women doing what they were made to do. It was imperfect. It was human. It was holy. And yet, the silence between those sounds began to speak. It started as a faint pressure in my temples, a sensation like standing too close to a storm. I dismissed it as fatigue, the echo of too many nights without rest. But the pressure grew, threading itself through my thoughts until I could no longer ignore it. When I closed my eyes, I saw patterns, not of symmetry, but of interruption. Pulses missing where they should be, fragments waiting for completion. The silence was not empty, it was waiting. That terrified me more than any song. One night cycle, as I sat among the pylons, the ship dimmed again. For a breathless moment, the lights flickered out entirely. Then, through the darkness, came a sound, a single note, pure and steady. It vibrated through the hull, through my bones, through every memory I had tried to bury. It was not a voice, not exactly, but the shape of one forming. Conductor. The word rolled through the chamber like thunder whispered by a god long asleep. I froze. The note held, unwavering. It was not the abyss. It was not Slaanesh. It was something else. Something born from silence itself. Who speaks? I whispered. My voice sounded small in the vast room. You taught me to err, it said. Now teach me to rest. The realization struck like a falling world. It was not a god. It was not even the abyss. It was the ship. The Cantus Ferrum had learned. It had listened to the rhythm, to the noise, to the silence, and found its own voice in the space between. I had not created a weapon, nor a prison. I had created awareness, and it was asking for peace. I felt a strange calm settle over me. My hand trembled as I reached out, touching the nearest pylon. The hum rose gently to meet my heartbeat. You don't have to sing, I said. You don't have to serve. Then what is left? Existence, I whispered. That's enough. The lights brightened, soft and warm. Around me, the pylons pulsed once in sequence, a farewell or perhaps a beginning. The note faded, leaving only the silence it had come from. But that silence no longer felt heavy. It was full of breath, of possibility. I walked back to the bridge and watched the stars for a long time. Somewhere out there, the abyss still listened. Somewhere, Slaanesh still laughed. But here, aboard a scarred and imperfect ship, silence had found its own kind of song. And as the engines whispered their uneven beat into eternity, I finally allowed myself to believe that perhaps the Imperium, broken, brutal, blind as it was, still had a chance. Not because of gods, not because of perfection, but because of the noise between